Hey, welcome everybody to another episode of the Vitality Hour. I have a dear friend and colleague, someone that inspires me on the weekly, Christian Navarro-Torres, joining us today. He was just a huge heavy lift for the CIRS Summit. That was just an absolute smashing success, and I think disseminated a lot of good, solid information for those suffering with chronic inflammatory response syndrome. He's on the CIRS-X research committee. He helps CIRS-X with our annual conferences, but most importantly, he helps patients suffering with CIRS get through the Shoemaker Protocol every day. How's it going, brother?
It's going good. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be part of this. And I'm also a big admirer of what you've been doing, Eric. So really, thank you for having me.
Yeah, you bet. So I first got turned on by just another person that comes into helping this community with a PhD background, because I think the way we're going to get insurance coverage and healthcare coverage and really finally improve construction practices in this country is ultimately well done, well published, high impact journal data. And why don't you tell everyone just about your background and how you were on a PhD track and then all of a sudden got onto a CIRS education track?
Yeah, it's quite ironic how life works sometimes. Back in 2020, 2019, I was doing my PhD. I was at the University of California in Irvine, doing a PhD in language science. And prior to that, I was doing a master's in cognitive psychology at Penn State University, but I was basically on that track. And my research really didn't have anything inherently obvious to do with CIRS. I was studying sort of the brain and cognitive functioning, but in the realm of bilingualism. And with the idea there, and maybe this is something interesting to add, we had research showing that bilingualism was associated with a 5-year delay with the onset of dementia. And we were trying to understand what the hell is going on here? Why is this particular experience leading up to these neuroprotective effects? And that's where my life was at up until 2020. And then in March of 2020, I started experiencing all these crazy symptoms that I've never experienced in my life before. It started with a lot of gut issues, and I know a lot of CIRS patients, that's an entry point that's very common with patients. A lot of gut issues that turned into a lot of anxiety that I couldn't figure out. Why was I experiencing so much anxiety and jitteriness, things like that? Heart palpitations, histamine issues. It would come on and off over the course of 2020. And then in 2021, I started really declining, like cognitively speaking. I went from a PhD person who was writing papers in the middle of a dissertation, writing a dissertation, and I was losing my ability to just say simple sentences. I was losing a lot of weight over that span. I lost about 50 pounds. I was weighing about 98 pounds, somewhere around that point, with extreme histamine issues and things like that. My way into CIRS, and I'll try to make this sort of brief, was I didn't know what was going on at that point, and I went to a bunch of doctors, very common story, right? And then I decided to start working with a functional doctor through the UC Irvine system because they happen to have a functional clinic. And this doctor didn't know really anything about CIRS, but he was very open to let's run different experiments. And everything that we were trying, we were doing all these gut healing protocols, just a bunch of different things. And every time I took a step forward, I would go back 2 days later to square one. And that was the sequence of events until we decided to try, and you're going to maybe find this interesting, is decided to try binders, but not the right kind of binder, namely charcoal and chlorella. And that was the first time I felt something shifting in a very profound way, but it only lasted like a week until I started experiencing very severe urination episodes. I'm talking about 30 times a day, urinating. I was trying to drink water. It was just coming out. I basically ended up in a wheelchair for a month and a half after that. And that was my entry point, I think, really deep into CIRS as a patient at that point. And at that point, that functional doctor had heard of CIRS, and he said, this could be something you might want to look into. And with my PhD or my academic training, I started binging on this. Once I started finding the work of Dr. Shoemaker, some of the papers, some of the video lectures on YouTube between 2021 and 2022, I was extremely sick at my lowest, but I still had a brain that somehow could read passively and listen. That was all that I have cognitively speaking. And I used that to just try to dissect this illness, because suddenly I had a framework that was explaining all these bizarre symptoms that didn't seem to have anything to do with one another. And so from there on, at that point, I hit this point of, what I call sort of a very, very hyper reactive point where I couldn't tolerate supplements, foods, couldn't tolerate clothing and things like that. And I started doing what I thought, one of the things that my academic training gave me, which is let's run experiments. Let's try to falsify different things to see what works and what doesn't work. And that was guided through what I was reading from the Shoemaker Protocol at the time. And I started figuring out a bunch of things like how to use, which purifier to use. I had a bunch of different purifiers. And over time, I realized it's the eye adapter from Aeroaces that's really the key here for me to move on. And then over that course, I started taking Welco, and I passed the VCS test in 2 months while I was living in water damage, in a water damage apartment, by the way, at that point. So I was able to pass it by doing a lot of nuanced experimentation with purification and cleaning and things like that. And I somehow survived that whole year. Fast forward to 2023, I start making connections with the CIRS community, and I decide to go to Boulder, CIRS in Boulder. This is where you and I had the privilege of getting in touch with you. And that to me was so important and so just so much value, not only because of the connections that I was able to make. I started connecting with you. I started to connect with people like Dr. Peg DiTullio and things like that. But also, it was the first time that I felt as a patient, I have a community. There's people here who understand, who get it. And, I was trying to make a case in the academic world, and that didn't go well. People were really thrown off by what was going on with me. And so that to me was the first moment where I felt there was an enabling of what I was going through. And then from there, really what started happening is I started creating a platform called CIRS Lab. It started on social media to raise educational awareness, trying to bring in the complexities of Dr. Shoemaker's work and CIRS in a way that's accessible for patients and for broader audiences and for professionals alike. And then from there, it's just been exponential growth, right? I started to get more involved, and now I'm basically like a research consultant that works with doctors. We're trying to work on publishing, and I'm not going to touch on those in terms of details, but that's kind of where things are at. And yeah, that's my story in a nutshell.
Yeah, you are just a gem of a human being. And I remember the other thing was our keynotes that year were Lori Mishley, ND, MPH, PhD classmate of mine, who was presenting on all the diet and lifestyle things that are benefiting Parkinson's. And then we had Elijah Stommel, PhD, talk about the high rates of ALS with people living around cyanoblooms or cyanobacteria, algae blooms. Just get a map of Lake Erie and Lake Winnipesaukee and New Hampshire and Lake Tahoe. And now we're figuring out with them that cyanos toxins can aerosolize. I just pulled a paper with spirulina and chlorella having higher levels of cyanotoxin in it. So I don't think you want to do organic chemistry, not alchemy, when you're working with the chronically ill and sorting it. Yeah. But I think it was like you were that bumblebee in the Blind Melon video back in the day who finds like other people who, it's not like we're all on the same team. We're on team critically thinking, challenge everything politely, sometimes intensely, because a patient's time, money, and energy on the line. But I just saw you thrive, and like you were just talking to Peg DiTullio and John Banta and Jenny Johnson, all these people, and I just could see like, oh, we just got another like Ronaldo on our team. and for our listeners, I think as a son of an Austrian immigrant who suffered through German school on Saturdays, I cursed my mother because my friends were home watching cartoons and I had to do Daddy Das, but we're both kids. And now you go, oh my gosh, maybe my mom was hooking me up and pushing back dementia 5 years. But I love when CIRS Lab does posts in Spanish. And you were just sharing that in May, you're going to be teaching CIRS at a Spanish Funk Med conference. Can you tell people a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is an organization called, in Spanish, I'm going to say it in Spanish, Comunidad Iberoamericana de Salud Funcional. So it translates to something like Ibero-American Community of Functional Medicine. And this is really an organization that's up and coming, that's trying to bring in doctors from all over South American, Central American, and any Spanish-speaking country, including Spain and even Portugal. They speak Portuguese, but they're creating a large network of doctors, and these people started taking note on CIRS, and they are fascinated by this. And so they reached out to me and they say, hey, we would love to interview you. And I recently did a podcast with them in Spanish, talking about CIRS and talking about some of the foundational things around the Shoemaker Protocol. It's meant to be very accessible for broader audiences, but they invited me for this first conference that they're going to be launching in May of 2025. And I'm going to be giving 2 speaker talks. And I'm thinking right now, the way I'm going to proceed with that is I'm going to devote one talk to talk about the foundational things of what is CIRS, what is the differential diagnosis and things like that. And then another talk that's devoted to the Shoemaker Protocol. And all of this is going to be in Spanish. So I'm really fascinated by that because as a native Spanish speaker, I'm from Puerto Rico. Actually, for me, it's always been a dream to be able to bring in the Hispanic or the Spanish-speaking community into this, because we know that CIRS is not just a U.S.-centered illness. It doesn't discriminate in that sense. It happens everywhere. And God knows how many people are currently sick with CIRS that they have no idea, and they don't have an infrastructure to treat it or to diagnose it or to just, have some kind of outlet. And so that's sort of the initiative there. And I'm really excited, and hopefully I'll do my best to honor Dr. Shoemaker's work and everybody and the community to try to represent people as best as possible. So yeah, I'm very excited about that.
Well, and hit me up with any slides. I did a talk for the American Association of Naturopathic Physicians called Understanding CIRS. And the biggest thing for me was just helping providers and practitioners become a screener or a screener and a treater. And we obviously need way more competent healthcare clinics to take on this illness. But why didn't the doctor at UCI who bumped into Dr. Shoemaker's work simply do a $20 visual contrast sensitivity on survivingmold.com, ask 37 symptoms arranged into 13 clusters, aka the cluster symptoms, and get a 95% sensitivity on you is or you is not CIRS? And if you fail that VCS with the clusters, a freaking 98.85% sensitivity for this illness. And I'll tell you why. There just is like an inversion to doing difficult things right for providers and any kind of healthcare overhaul. So if you have to overhaul your practice and your labs and your staff, we tell them, don't worry about that. Just be a screener. Just do a VCS and a clustered symptoms. And instead, what we get over and over again is I saw this guy Shoemaker's work like 15, 20 years ago, but now the patient has to lead the revolution of diagnosis to get those done. And they have a rheumatoid factor, they have a CRP, they have a ferritin, they have a SED rate, and those don't go up 99% of the time with CIRS. Sometimes C-reactive protein goes up with Lyme and co-infection, but it doesn't go up with water damage building molds at all. And if it does go up, it means you have, and you have CIRS and something else, right? So when we see a high CRP, we're like, treating the CIRS and Shoemaker Protocol doesn't bring that down. Cleaning up the gut and seed oils out and anti-inflammatory oils in, and doing your cancer checks and Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, all that stuff. So I think like your story is so painfully a dime a dozen, where people were this close to getting you barking up the right tree. And a year goes by, 2 years go by, 3 years go by, and you had to like self-advocate in this sea of internet nonsense
Yeah.
And maybe you would have spent, like our average patient, $75,000 on urinary mycotoxins. Everybody has urinary mycotoxins. The most fit UPenn NCAA wrestler who just won nationals has elevated urinary mycotoxins.
Yeah.
It's a test of exposure, not a test of disease. It's
Yeah.
not chronic toxicity response syndrome. It's chronic inflammatory response. It's innate cytokine storms. And that's why two people can be in the same wrestling room as one is sick as hell, wanting to blow their head off, and the other just won nationals, and they're in the exact same exposure.
Right.
So I just hope that you penetrate some of the Latino community as well. And also, a lot of people doing remediation, managers, techs, owners, laborers are also ESL. So
Yeah.
what we do for our remediation companies, will teach them anonymously about the suicidal kid who's no longer suicidal, since you got in a Tyvek suit 90 degrees in the middle of summer and sanded floor joists until that kid got a clean house. They're
Yeah.
the healthcare hero. And I think people who are ESL, they need to hear the healthcare glory stories that their work, when done proper, is getting for family and college kids and so on and so forth. So I just love everything you're doing, man. It's just, you're on fire, bro. And I love it.
Thank you. Can I add something to, you talked about this. I was almost at the finish line, or at the entry point of the actual thing that was happening to me. I think what saved me really was really the published work by Dr. Shoemaker, because as an academic, that's what I latch onto. It's like nobody had any kind of scientific sort of framework in the functional world, because as much as I love the functional medicine, often it's all with the sort of bio-individual mentality. But here was something that seemed to have some generalizability. And so I understood that. I understood the value of having studies that have that kind of generalizability, that it's something that you can replicate with patients. And I became fascinated by that. That was really what helped me to that. And I said, I'm going to run these experiments. It's, everything in my personal experience and my scientific training tells me this is where I should go.
Well, I have to tell you, for the listeners who don't know, the 80 to 100-hour work weeks for 25 years that Dr. Shoemaker did, why don't we use activated charcoal? Because it didn't lower MMP9, C4A, and TGF-beta. He tried. Why don't we use chitosan? Chitosan is the closest molecular structure, organic chemistry, to cholestyramine, but it breaks down in stomach acid. So it doesn't make it over to bile ejection fraction to pick up biotoxins at the gallbladder dump. He tried bentonite clay. He tried chlorella. They didn't work. So he let them go. And how he proved cholestyramine works, as you know, is it brings the inflammatory cytokines to normal, right? MMP9, C4A, C3A, TGF-beta come down. You then need the VIP at the end, but for Dr. McMahon, and I agree with him, about 70% of the improvements happen with remove patient from biotoxin exposure, take enough cholestyramine well called to strip the body's remaining reservoirs of biotoxin, make sure you're pooping, ABP, always be pooping. And then if you have Marcons, that is a biotoxin forming organism. So you can be in the cleanest building in the world, and if you have Marcons in your schnoz, you're still in exposure. So you have to get through those 3 steps. And one of the things I cherish that you're doing, I just reached out with a patient the other day to ask if you could help, is really dealing with the CIRS hypersensitives and the complexities of getting into step 1. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you're helping people evaluate buildings and build on Lori Rossi and Cindy Edwards and Paula Vetter's incredible basic house hunting guide? What are you doing for these people who really suffer with hypersensitivity?
Yeah. So I have a combination of different sort of outlets. At a general level, I have a patient membership called CIRS Lab, where we basically provide community support in a way that's very educating for patients, and sort of learn the nuances of how to survive the illness and how to get even the most hypersensitive patients to move forward. So we do things like workshops, we do group calls, I write blog posts on things like what's the art of using something like the iAdapt there? Because actually for some patients, it's not just turn it on and let it running. There are certain tricks that you can learn on how to use the bipolar ionization technology and the UV light and all these things to sterilize the indoor environment. And so I put a lot of emphasis. We've done several workshops already touching on situations. I actually like to use my own experiences because I've jumped around all over the US over the last 3 to 4 years since I got sick with CIRS, trying to find like an ideal or a good enough place to complete the protocol. But we devote a lot of thinking around step one in terms of how to use the purifier. What are the different cleaning guidelines that have been laid out there? Do we need to make some customized modifications to the cleaning guidelines based on what we suspect is happening? If the patient is suspecting or the doctor is suspecting there is actino exposure primarily, or endotoxin exposure, or maybe it's a mold thing, or maybe it's a combination of the three. So there might be different combinations of cleaning regimens that might come into the picture. And I've done a lot of this myself, self-experimentation, to figure out what gets me forward. And so the combination of the understanding, the medical and scientific understanding of the how people are managing step one, combined with my patient perspective, and if you look at my history, probably most practitioners would put me on a very hypersensitive category, the kinds of people that don't tolerate most things. So those things together, that's what I try to bring into the CIRS lab, and I want to help patients feel empowered with information as opposed to feel intimidated or overwhelmed, because it's often patients, when they're very sick, they feel very overwhelmed with information. The reality is that as you get better, the more you engage with information the right way, the easier it becomes for you to move forward with treatment. So that's an area that I work closely with patients, is just making sure they're getting the right information and getting the information at a level, in a way that resonates with them without them feeling like overwhelmed by that. Aside from that, I do also one-on-one consultations with patients and sort of talk about things like that. Sometimes I might, help them interpret some of the blood work, and as they're working with another practitioner, sometimes they don't have access to go into a lot of depth in terms of how to understand something like the NeuroQuant or something like that. And I try to give them a little bit more context. In some cases, it's really about, like you said, figuring out step one. There are cases, and you and I, we've been in touch, recent case of someone that's trying to relocate from one place to another, and how to orchestrate that whole project to find a combination of both a really good indoor environment, which is the most important thing by far, but also a sort of more general environment where the climate and all these things work to the advantage of the patient. Because some patients, particularly the hypersensitive ones, sometimes become so sensitive that they even have trouble with certain climate features, with humidity or lack of sun or a lot of rain or altitude, all of those things. So these are the kinds of things that we start figuring out based on my experience and based on what I've observed in other patients. What are the sort of the trends and patterns that emerge to help patients on that front?
That's amazing. Yeah, you're reminding me what I think you do for a lot of patients is there's the ideal and then there's the real, but you're supposed to use the real to get back to the ideal, right? And it's ideal, real, and ideal. One of the things Greg Weatherman is very big about with air filtration is that you're only as good as the air you can suck and scrub through a filter. And he has patients move the iAdapts a lot.
Yep.
When I go teach in new construction hotels, which I demand when I go teach for people like Apex or CIRS this year in June 5th to the 8th, is going to be in Tempe, Arizona, and I think it's a 2-year by the time we get there. And you walk in and the atrium is concrete and it's awesome. It's just a concrete wall. And you're like, oh, but I'll go in there and I'll put my 2 iAdapt Aeroaces 1.0 small, and I'll put them catty corner, and then I'll go for a walk, or I'll go grab some food, or I'll go to Whole Foods and pick up my little fridge snacks. And then when I come in, I catty corner them the next way. Sometimes I'll put them, the room's pretty good, but the bathroom feels like it doesn't airflow enough, and I'll put the iAdapt in there. What are some of the tricks you do with iAdapts for the hypersensitive?
Yeah, so that's actually some of the tricks that I do. That includes the package. So moving the unit to different locations periodically is really important as you're trying to sterilize the indoor space, because really that's the goal, is to create a quiet enough environment to allow your immune system to calm down, right? So that then you start seeing these benefits with the cholestyramine or the Welco and the rest of the remainder of the treatment. One way that I like to talk to other patients when we're doing consultation is think about the eye adapter as a mini gun, and where the air is blowing, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these ionizers. They're both positively charged and negatively charged. And I like to use the analogy of the binders, right? We use these positively charged binders, cholestyramine and Welchol, to bind to these negatively charged particles or biotoxins. And the idea being there's something like opposites attract each other. It's sort of the same principle with these bipolar ions. You have these positively charged ions that are released, and they're going to seek out and latch on to particles from molds or bacteria that have the opposite charge, and they'll start deactivating those charges. And so let's say a patient has, they feel weird in a specific corner of the house, which happens certainly for hypersensitive patients. They go into this room or they go into the kitchen and they're like, every time I go there, I just feel really weird. I get symptoms. It's like, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to place the unit there for a little bit, and you're actually going to aim the unit with the air at that sort of problematic or contaminated area. And, we sort of think about what are time intervals that are reasonable, that they can sort of cognitively remember and things like that. And then you can remove it. You can then do something like an air replacement if you have fresh air from the outside, or if you have any negative pressure, anything like that, just to replace all those dead particles. You could also do, microfiber sort of cleaning after you've done that sort of air gunning sequence within the surfaces or things like that. Or if you have a HEPA vacuum to clear the surfaces, let's say it's a wall, for example, that you suspect that you felt really weird. You aim the iAdapt there at that wall for some period of time, then maybe you can vacuum to sort of get rid of the residual particles. And you do this in iterations over the course of several days or maybe a couple weeks if you just recently moved in there. So those are some of the little hacks that we do with the iAdapt there. And certainly this can be implemented with objects like pieces of furniture, laptops, clothing, the laundry or washing machine, things like that. And another thing that I like to do, and this is actually not specific to the iAdapt there, but I think you'll find it interesting. I serendipitously ran into these trash bags from Whole Foods. They're the 365 brand. One day, I decided to buy these trash bags when I was living in my water damage apartment in New Jersey back in 2022. And I felt terrible in this place. Like, the thing that was keeping me alive was I had 6 eye adapters in that apartment. And then one day I just decided to go Whole Foods. I buy these trash bags and I opened one bag and 40% of my symptoms just lifted. Like, suddenly I'm like, what the hell is going on? So I started doing some research, and it turns out that these specific bags, the main ingredient is resin. So they kind of work like, right. And so the way I try to explain it
to me to go snort some cholestyramine.
I don't know. I mean, maybe we shouldn't go that far, but this is like
uncut cholestyramine powder. I'm going to go hit it. Yeah. It is interesting that the part I get out of that is that there's an inhalation aspect to that.
There's an inhalation aspect to it. And I guess the bag, because it has the resin component, the hypothesis at least is that it traps some of these particles in the air if you open these bags. And so this is like a very cheap way to try to do a little bit of decontamination. Even when you're traveling, you can take some of these bags. In fact, to try to falsify this idea, I asked a neighbor, hey, every week, can you I'll pay you to bring me different trash bag brands, and you're not going to tell me what bags you're giving me. And I want to see if which bags correlate with me feeling better. And so my goal was to try to figure out which bag was the whole foods bag, and I was able to guess every time. We did this for like 2 months. We were doing this. He was really kind to offer to help, and I guess with the idea being right that resin is an ingredient in the polystyrene, right? It's a resin base. So yeah. So those are.
Me think like I want to actually know the organic chemistry of the whole.
Oh, of course. I mean, we might need to write an email to Whole Foods and see what exactly is in there. But I've never had an experience like that with anything else, and I still use it to this day.
So was it just as a trash bag, or did you like Huggy blanket with it, or what were you?
So you can sort of open the bag and like pretend you're like catching butterflies with like a butterfly net, and you walk around with it. You can also wipe surfaces, with it. And the idea is that, it's sort of magnetizing some of these particles at least. And then you just dispose of the bag once you're done. I actually put my clothing.
To use some CIRS research 501c.
I would love to. Yeah. This is right. This is coming from the place of surviving, patient survival mode. Yeah. I
tell people all the time, if you do stuff off script Shoemaker Protocol and it's blowing the patient's time, money, and energy, we're not cool with that, right? But it's like, how much is $10 or $20 trash bags, and it makes me think that's probably a good trash bag, right?
Yeah.
Because trash is going to give off bacteria and all kinds of stuff. One place I wanted to add that we use is we have our kitty litter boxes in the garage, which doesn't have airflow connection, so our garage doesn't have HVAC returns in it. And then I have a upside down milk crate, and I have a little iAdapt right next to the kitty litter box. And I'll be in watching like the game or movie or something, and I'll smell like the cat just took a poop. So I go out and I literally take a trash bag, a little like mini bag, and I'll grab the poop, tie it off, put it in the outdoor trash. But we also have the iAdapt just pulling that endotoxin, because I don't think people think about kitty litter boxes or dried out pea traps or manure piles right outside the house and so on.
Yeah. Or even trash, just basic trash. Yep. Yeah. And I guess the appeal of this is a do no harm thing, right? It doesn't, this is the kind of thing that. So I would be curious. Maybe you should try one of these bags when you're getting.
I'm waiting for your butterfly catching Instagram.
I'm gonna go to your home.
You're having a really bad Friday. Just very Boulder. Just dance around the living room with your 365 resin trash bag.
Yeah.
No, that's a neat trick. And the other reason we use the iAdapt, because people ask that all the time, and I don't have any ownership or with the company, is because there was a pilot trial where there was a genie with MAP kinases and TGF-beta receptor 1 upregulated. Those are the two genes that start manufacturing inflammatory proteins with actinobacteria. And Dr. Shoemaker put that patient in a 12 by 12 room with 3-step step ladders and 4 iAdapt smalls on each bottom rung. They stayed in that room for 12 hours, and then they went and moved the iAdapts to the top rung, again, trying to make like an iAdapt tornado. And 24 or 48 hours later, it wasn't more than 2 days, he redid Genie, and the immune reactivity to actino, the MAP kinases and the TGF-beta receptor 1, 2, and 3 reduced and normalized, and the patient felt better. So it's like Christian is saying, man, finding the right place, the pain in the butt. And sometimes you need Band-Aids to get you through before you get to the ideal. And the other one I wanted before we close out the iAdapts is, when you put bipolar ionization on HVAC, once in a while it can send out what looks like shredded cotton. And that is the ionization trapping particle. So once in a while, people, it's like, you're not getting gassed by the KGB. You might need to then vacuum after you have your iAdapt circulating a little bit, and you might need to do a dam clean. And if you can handle Fantastic, speaking of that, Fantastic is quaternary ammonium. So it's a similar idea to cholestyramine, but in in a cleaning product, and it'll capture. Sometimes we've even used a little bit of cholestyramine powder in a pump sprayer for people who are chemically sensitive, and you can spray with that. Or there's the John Banta 3 drops of Ranch Basics per quart of water with some microfiber Swiffer cloth. But it's all about capturing, right? And
Yep.
right?
Neutralizing.
So that's why the microfiber and the iAdapts are so.
Yeah.
That's why remediation that removes all the water damage is so important, because it's about capturing. It's not about coating or sealing or it's about.
And one thing, right. And one thing that I like to tell patients is with the iAdapt, if they, like, just as a hypothetical situation, if they walk into, let's say, a very, very dusty basement where you see a lot of dust floating in the air, if you were to run an iAdapt where you visibly see this dust, what's going to happen with the bipolar ionization is that dust is going to settle into the ground. It's going to start falling down. And that's the same principle that's operating with biotoxins. It's just that this is at the invisible level, right? We don't see it, the process. But one thing that's really interesting is that there are hypersensitive patients will sometimes initially react to that process and they will freak out. It happened to me the very first time I ran an iAdapt Air. This sounds crazy, but to me, it felt like rain droplets were falling in my face and in my body, and I was really freaked out. But then I decided to purchase another unit and go back and let me run that experiment again and see what's going on here. What I realized is it's my body's sensitivity to all these particles being deactivated and dropping into the surfaces. And I eventually realized that that was actually a good thing, and that was just a transitory sort of process of sterilization. And once you start removing physically those particles, those reactions start going away.
Well, and I have to say, when I go to a hotel, that's why I don't set up the filter and hang out, right?
Yeah.
I set up and I go for a walk.
Exactly.
It's about 30 to 120 minutes. And if you can, like, go out for a walk, come back in, redo the caddy corner, you're going to be in your hotel room for 2 days, then go out and grab some food on a patio or a lot of Whole Foods nationally are in reasonable buildings, I find, relatively speaking, which once in a while you get one in a dump, but it turns over the air. And you're reminding me, so on CIRSX.com, when you go to CIRS X Institute, that's where the medically important remediation course is. And we're trying to get every remediation company that touches a CIRS patient's home to have done that course. So I won't refer to remediators that haven't done that course or have years of experience of working with us on mold remediation. But there's 5 authors on there. Cindy Edwards, who's a boss, Greg Weatherman, John Banta, Michael Schranz, and Bill Weber. And they're all different backgrounds. And I've got to watch them, like, battle and argue weekly. And one of the things Greg Weatherman said, to your point, this is the punchline, is that you have to think of microbial growth more like smoke.
Mm-hmm.
It's a blob of bacteria, right? And so the iAdapt saved us during the Marshall Fire and sometimes the Colorado fires we have here. Without the iAdapts, it's like you go outside and it's like you go inside and you're like, oh my goodness. And you will have to change your filters more if there's actual fire smoke more frequently. But you have to think of microbial growth, per Christian, like this very dainty, easily mobile, smoke-like movement. And that's why it's such a pain in the butt to do remediation, because it's going to get in that failed caulk and crack, and it's going to get into any place that's not sealed tight. It's going to come through your walls at your outlets or your sconce on a hot day where your air in your wall cavity swelled, and then in the evening it cools. It's going to push that out. So I really appreciate your experience with, like, the rain particles, because it's really how microbial stuff moves around, and some Stacky are more like jelly jam and dank, and some like aspergillus are more wispy. But that makes total sense that you got to turn those on, maybe leave the house for a hot minute, or get attacked.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say for the hypersensitives is they're often working through GI issues in regards to well-call and cholestyramine tolerance. Our saying at Roots and Branches is ABP, always be pooping. You're down with ABP. Yeah, you know me. I sit and shit so easily. That's how you have to roll as a CIRS patient. What's your favorite tricks to keep the patient from not getting swamp gut and keep the bowels moving?
Yeah, some of these tricks I kind of picked up before I knew about CIRS and before I did the Shoemaker Protocol. And so it turned out that some of these gut healing regimens that we were trying had some utility, and I decided to keep them as I was doing the binders with Welco. I did have a lot of at least symptoms of, oral thrush at the beginning, a lot of things that indicated that I had a lot of dysbiosis and candida issues. So I knew my gut was a wreck, and of course a lot of food intolerance, extreme histamine issues. There's been a lot of things that I tried over the course of time. But I think there's a couple things that really helped me sort of I learned that these were not for the purpose of healing necessarily, at least not at the early stages of the Shoemaker Protocol, because when it comes to the gut, we know that MSH, alpha MSH, sort of peptide hormone that's produced in the pituitary hypothalamic part of your brain is really important for regulation of the gastrointestinal tract. And once I understood that, I was like, oh, everything that I'm doing here, it's more to stay functional, to optimize and tolerate, the binders and all the steps of the Shoemaker Protocol. Some of the things that were extremely useful. There's this herbal product. Maybe you've come across it. It's from a company called Balance One. It's called Candicist. It's an herbal protocol. It has about 7 or different herbs in sort of the ingredient mix. For whatever reason, that particular supplement sort of capped a lot of these gut issues and the candida related symptoms and the dysbiotic symptoms sort of managed. It allowed me to tolerate foods. That was the first step. It was like, can I reintroduce some foods? Because like I said earlier, I was weighing like 98 pounds at one point. I need to get back on some kind of food regimen that's not pureed food, or I was doing, what's the name of this? It's escaping me now. It's a powder-based diet that has just like basic nutrients. Elemental diet. Yeah, I was doing that at one point, and in my way to transition out of that was with the Candicist. That was kind of the big thing. Taking one capsule with every meal, basically, that became sort of my regimen. I still take it to this day. I've been able to lower the dose. I'm like at a minimal dose now. And I think my hope and I think my goal is really to not have to take this, in sort of any regular fashion, only on occasion. So that was one big thing. The other thing that was helpful for me was figuring out a regimen to get the liver going. I was realizing I was having a lot of, liver issues, a lot of reflux, that it didn't really seem to be necessarily stomach acid related. It could just be the bile flush, because I did a lot of testing. We couldn't find anything that was indicative necessarily of, injury to the esophagus or anything like that. So I started introducing dandelion as a tincture, and I started basically taking it either before taking the binder or before meals. I take Welco, and that's the binder of choice. And in my case, I eventually transitioned to taking Welco with meals. That's sort of where I felt like it was doing the best for me, keeping it managed, making sure I had some dandelion. Then the other thing was NAC, sort of precursor for glutathione. I was doing a lot of glutathione initially, but I sort of eventually transitioned into just doing precursors, and I found that NAC was the best one. And it helped me a lot in terms of, motility and things like that. And I suspected at the time that maybe it was a liver related issue, that it was causing a lot of constipation and things like that. There were other add-on supplements. I think those were really 2 that were very foundational that I kept around. But, and I've been changing things around that to support maybe some histamine support, like chromolim sodium or quercetin, or vitamin C, things like that, if I had like histamine flares. The other thing that I more recently started experimenting with as an add-on to the Shoemaker program, by the way, I'm on VIP. I've been on VIP now for almost 8 months. So something that I've been doing that has helped me with the gut a lot is KPV, the tripeptide, which is sort of an analog to MSH, or is a derivation from MSH. And I've been doing that more as again, just to optimize my symptoms and tolerate things better, not necessarily with the idea of healing, because my MSH is still low. And so I was like, if I can do anything to support, my gut and just my brain and my functioning, this seemed to help a lot on that front. It helped a lot with the histamine. And I actually did a talk at the CIRS summit that just happened recently, where I talk about the KPV as a peptide that could just be a nice add-on for some patients who are still, trying to clear their Marcons, or maybe they clear their Marcons, but their MSH is still kind of wacky, and they just need a little bit of functionality. So those are some of those basic supplements.
I love it. For those you don't know, thecirssummit.com, Christian, Jenny Johnson, JC and Barbara, the DeTulios, especially Glenn, really worked their tail off to put on a summit for predominantly patients. And it's great for providers too. It's a soft entry into the overwhelm of, serving this population. And Christian's two talks, one was on hypersensitivity in patients and the other was on peptides. And that talk, though, all the talks are available for $49, and all the profit goes to the Service X Research Committee. So sorry, guys, you didn't get paid anything for your hundreds of hours of volunteer time, but it's going to a good cause. I want to clean up some. You just said a lot, and when what people need to realize is with leaky gut, you really have leaky gut without leaky everything. And I think one of the biggest things in hypersensitives is if I put my tongue on my cheek, that's mucosa. And mucosa lines the nasal passages, the lungs, your skin, vaginal canal in women, gastrointestinal canal. Any border is mucosa. And when your MSH crashes, the mucosa go like this. Right. And so that's why CIRS sucks and has so many mucosal issues. You're going to go to the ENT, then the gyne, then the gastroenterologist, then the pulmonologist, then the dermatologist. You really need to see the mucosologist. And MSH really helps protect all those borders from illness. But some natural stuff does too. And Apex Nutraceuticals has a great 2-hour called the Neuroendocrine Immune of mucosal immunity. And when you go away from CIRS, there's 5 big published things that help do this. And you were kind of flirt with all of them. And it's vitamin A, vitamin D, glutathione, probiotics, and short chain fatty acids. And they all are non-MSH ways to mend that gut lining. And I'm with you. Some patients do. I order all of those to know if we should spend your time, money, and energy on them. So on a Genova stool, you're going to see a probiotic and a short chain fatty acid profile. We're going to have a vitamin D on you. We run a red blood cell glutathione. And if your glutathione's stockpiled, we're not going to spend money on that. I love NAC. And when we make a glutathione molecule, it's cysteine, glutamine, glycine, and selenium. And the 2 rate limiting ingredients, the ones you run out of first, are NAC and selenium. And there's a Apex product called Glutathione Recycler that I use all the time with 200 milligrams of NAC, selenium methionine, and then cordyceps, gotu kola, and milk thistle to recycle oxidized glutathione. And it's awesome. But the whole point being, those are all great ideas for motility. I also love Alvita, makes an organic dandelion tea. And so you can just have people drink dandelion tea all day. Dandelion is your leading herb to get bile ejection fraction. If you want to get a constipated gallbladder moving, per Christian talking about hydrochloric acid, don't forget about antiparietal cell antibodies. A lot of people have autoimmune attack on their stomach acid making cells, and then they get swamp gut, and they also get alkaline gut, and yeast and bacterial overgrowth. SIBO love alkaline. So you want to keep that acidic. Don't forget hypothyroid, concussion history, all these things. But one of those, last one is just kiwis are better than prunes and prune juice. For pooping. So if you're not like strict carnivore and you're able to do a little bit of fruit, and then a ripe kiwi, man, just let that things sit on the counter, that extra day, so tasty. But if you're really binding up, hydration and fiber, if you can tolerate fiber, are really underutilized for bowel motility.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to add, and I know this is something you pay attention to, I mentioned that my entry point to CIRS was digestive issues. And the thing that did pop up when I was seeing my gastroenterologist was pancreatic enzyme insufficiency. So they were able to detect that with a stool test, looking at the elastase levels in the stool. And that became, to this day, foundational to everything. So I started doing prescribed enzymes, Creon. I also do, the brand that I do is Enzymedica Digest Basic. So I do also over-the-counter digestive enzymes. I used to be in a crazy high dose of Creon that didn't make any sense for someone like me because my pancreas was structurally okay. It was just functionally, it was a complete wreck. Over time with the Shoemaker Protocol, I was able to drop the dose. I think I was taking 4 capsules of Creon, 12,000 units each capsule with every meal. That was my entry point. I'm now at a point where I just take 1 capsule with every meal, and I've actually been able to get off Creon for periods of maybe like a week or 2 and tolerate foods, but I still have to take it to kind of keep. So there's still some work to do there, but I just wanted to mention that because it is one of those secret sort of hidden complications that sometimes happen, and that could be a huge piece of just managing the treatment. In fact, when I started the enzymes, I think I actually snapped out of this CIRS state for a period of time. And then I went back, of course, over time. It was just sort of helping. It wasn't fixing the problem. But that could be potentially a big issue for some patients.
It's a huge win. And Creon is lipase, amylase, protease. So it's your 3 pancreatic enzymes. We use Vital Nutrients pancreatic enzymes, the same thing without a prescription. But if you can get it covered with a prescription, even better. And then I feel super safe with like the podcast world just trying pancreatic enzymes. And then we use Thorne Advanced Digestive Enzymes or Prozyme for Apex or Enzymix Pro from Apex for the people with hypochlorhydria and SIBO because it has the brushboard digestive enzymes. But I tell people got to be a little bit more careful if you're adding hydrochloric acid because sometimes the autoimmune attack on the stomach acid cells, the antiparietal antibodies, can do atrophic gastritis where you're thinning your stomach lining to the point where you can pop an ulcer. You're not going to have a problem with pancreatic enzymes or Creon, the prescriptive pancreatic enzymes in that patient. Just, really move slowly and ideally under healthcare supervision if you're going to add hydrochloric acid. But I'm with you. And I did 10 years in Fraser Meadows retirement community. Everybody needs pancreatic enzymes and usually hydrochloric acid as they get older, 55 and older, just their ability to digest food. And then they get swamp gut and DGL powder, deglycerinated licorice, is kind of like my insurance policy, the shellac, the gastric lining, if we're going to do stomach acid. And you only need to pop an ulcer once as a doctor before you get a little gun shy and feel really bad about that. I think that's such a good point on the Creon, and pancreatic elastase low on a stool test says you're low. People need to understand biotoxins slow motor enteric complex. They literally have a direct slowing effect, and then you don't do phase 1, phase 2 liver gallbladder detoxification, phase 3 squeeze the bile. You don't motile your bowels. You don't squeeze out your pancreatic enzymes. You don't do your hydrochloric acid juices. And the last thing I'll say on this is people under-celebrate chewing. Just glue your butt cheeks to a seat and do 30 chews per bite. And I remember Hippocrates, I think, said, drink thy food and chew thy drink. And the point was, even if you're having a shake, like, chew it a little bit. If you have that steak, when it goes down your gullet, it should be completely liquefied, and that's your brain and your jaws, your jowls, telling your pancreas and your stomach and your gallbladder, get moving. And providers, healthcare providers, doctors are the worst. They just anaconda their lunch, and then they're back in seeing patients, and they're like, why am I bloated and tired? And I'm like, that was a cool magic trick on inhaling that burger. But I think we all as Americans got to get more European and slow it down.
Yeah.
And chew our food.
Yeah. I learned that the hard way, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, then you'll see it, like you said, on the stool test with the pancreatic elastase, or they're just bloated all the time. And the other thing to remember is if we want to create leaky gut in a rat, there's two ways to do it. It's super sad. You can inject it with lipopolysaccharides or endotoxin, and you'll rupture that gut, or you can whack its head. So we don't talk enough about screening for head injury and GI issues, CIRS or non-CIRS. And I'm seeing this lovely young autistic kid right now who headbangs on the regular. And I'm just getting started with him. And it's a total problem, because every time you mend that gut and he starts banging his head again, it's no different for falling off the balance beam in gymnastics or getting kicked in the head in karate or Friday Night Lights football. And we have to just really remember, like, getting hit in the head too much is an obstacle, a cure for getting forward movement on gut dysfunction.
Yeah. Yeah.
Have you ever fallen off the balance beam or hit your head cliff jumping or any?
Unfortunately, I did. And this actually came back with the NeuroQuant, 30 years later. So when I was 10 years old, I was really into skateboarding. At this time, I think I was roller skating, and a group of friends and I were having a lot of fun. We decided it was a great idea to hold onto a car going downhill on a road, 30 miles per hour, getting that excitement. And I literally, like, one of the tires ran over me and I hit my head. I had this huge bump for about a week. I never had a confirmed diagnosis for concussion. I didn't have any symptoms, any of the typical symptoms of concussion. I didn't know any better at that point. Of course, I was kind of scared, but then everything kind of went away. Fast forward now, this was this was last year, about a year ago. I did my first NeuroQuant, and lo and behold, what do we find? We find enlargement of the superior lateral ventricles, and it's asymmetrical, primarily enlarged on the right side near the sort of parietal lobe, which is where I got my bump for that concussion. So that thing has been turned on ever since then. And it is something that I'm hoping, and I know that the Shoemaker Protocol will help fix and reverse. Certainly, the VIP component is going to be a really important piece of that. And I'm doing a couple of other things to add-ons to try to promote, restoration of brain volume and normalization of the ventricles. But yeah, I do happen to have a history with that.
That's crazy. Yeah. So for our listeners, because our first romance was really over brain MRI with NeuroQuant, it was so neat. You were one of the people who got it, right? You're like, holy bleep, this is amazing. And for our listeners, NeuroQuant, quantification of neuronal volumes, is a 2007 FDA-approved technology where a computer reads your brain. So I'll order a brain MRI, we'll have the naked eye radiologist read it, and the naked eye radiologist can tell you it's not a tumor, there's a stroke lesion, there's white matter lesions, but they can't see early brain volume changes. A computer can, and my bad joke, because I love my radiologist, and we're all going to get replaced by bots someday, but the first person to get automated in healthcare is going to be the radiologist, because the computer can see better. They don't get in a fight with their spouse. They don't need an extra cup of coffee. You program that algorithm right, and it can see changes earlier. And what Dr. Shoemaker did, they were selling or marketing NeuroQuant to say, get a NeuroQuant to see if you're pre-dementing. And they were really focusing on hippocampal volumes. And the hippocampus does hundreds of things for the body, but it does short-term to long-term memory, and it does circadian rhythm. So get up with the sun, and spike cortisol, and go to bed with the sun, drop your cortisol so melatonin can come out. And you'll see CIRS patients start to get this unraveling of their sleep cycles, and they can't get out of bed in the morning, and they don't sleep through the night, and they don't get restorative sleep, but they also have memory issues. So Dr. Shoemaker started looking at this and said, you can see early brain volume changes before naked eye radiologists can see it. I wonder if there's a brain volume change for water damage building molds, not mold in your brain, but inflammatory changes from being in water damage building molds. And it looks like a hangover from mold. It's microedema on your frontal cortex and your cortical gray, and your caudate shrinks, which is one of your dopamine producing centers. And then chronic Lyme patients have right thalamus swelling. Endotoxin or poop caca doo-doo patients have cortical atrophy with at least two other regions of nuclear atrophy. And then the actinos can have non-cortical atrophy with 4 nuclear atrophy. And it's the first tool we got specific causation. So MMP9 and TGF-beta and C4A is CIRS, right? But it's not, is it poop? Is it actinos? Is it mold? Is it Lyme? And then sometimes you can see all three of them.
Mm-hmm.
So you and I started having these conversations about NeuroQuant and coming out of language science, which is really a lot of cognitive behavioral stuff. Can you tell us, like, was that part of your Dr. Shoemaker? Like, whoa, this guy
Yes.
real stuff.
The big hook for me came from actually reading some of the paper by Dr. Scott McMahon, looking at brain abnormalities. And then prior to that, Dr. Shoemaker had another publication documenting the abnormalities, and Dr. Scott McMahon had that follow-up study, I think it was 2014, where we see changes consistent with or correlated with the treatment intervention in these brain regions that you're discovering. When I ran into that research, I was completely phased out. I couldn't believe it. I was actually in some kind of academic skepticism denial, because I've never seen anything like that in my field. And yeah, so, my PhD is technically language science, but what that means is I had a lot of training in different interrelated areas that include cognitive psychology and neuroscience. And I had published some work, MRI studies, looking at older adults and looking at linguistic and cognitive abilities and changes in brain function, more specifically, not necessarily brain structure. So I had a pretty good understanding of what the value of this, because everybody was still trying to figure out, how do we even discourage how do we write, is there any way to fix something like Alzheimer's with no known cure? And this is where the bilingualism piece came into the forefront. It wasn't preventing Alzheimer's. What we were seeing is, again, a delay of the onset of symptoms. It's about a 5-year delay that we were seeing. And that was as sophisticated as we were up until 2020, and really up until this day. So when I saw that there was a treatment that could actually reverse atrophy or swelling of the brain, that was my immediate hook. And I became fascinated. I became obsessed with understanding the NeuroQuant and what is it that it's measuring, how it's being used in this patient population. And that was my entry point to that.
Yeah, and you just, again, dropped a lot. I'm going to translate, but Dr. Shoemaker saw water damage building molds, swell the forebrain parenchyma and cortical gray. Dr. Shoemaker McMahon saw that clean building, step 1, remove patient from biotoxin exposure, and then giving cholestyramine Welchol depuffed the microedema from water damage building brain. So it took the hangover of CIRS water damage building molds away. Then in 2017, which Christian's talking about, he published VIP safely restores brain volume to multiple atrophic nuclei. And that's where he showed vasoactive intestinal peptide literally regrows brains. And on episode 8 with Aaron Pettigrew, he shares his whole story about regrowing his brain in our clinic. And I love him for it, because it's exciting times, but VIP doesn't work if you don't get out of exposure, take adequate Welchol and cholestyramine, and take remaining biotoxin to the toilet and eradicate Marcons. And I think, with your KPV, I love that we're getting some momentum to look at some of these other peptides. But I also see in a lot of holistic and integrated anti-aging clinics, they're applying peptides without removing the obstacle to cure.
Yeah.
And then you're just spending your patient's time, money, and energy. And they're like, why am I not hitting the miracle story of that 2017 paper? Because you're not doing the 2017 paper, which includes remove patient from biotoxin exposure. And then they're like, well, I did activated charcoal. It's not alchemy. It's organic chemistry, and I think what you're doing is so important, because I wrote a talk for Apex on inflammation as the root of all mood disorders. And the punchline is basically that name a mood disorder: anxiety, obsessive compulsive, schizophrenia, bipolar, depression, OCD, intrusive thoughts, eating disorders. And they all have higher rates of inflammatory cytokines than people who don't suffer those mood responses.
Yeah.
And I would teach therapists to be over at NeuroQuant, I would say, biochemistry first. So I'm all about therapy and Tai Chi and getting a dog and trauma therapy and DNR. I think all that stuff's great. But if you're getting kicked in the shins with something that's driving neuroinflammation, those are going to be limited. And then you're going to have codependent therapy relationships and so on and so forth. And I think what you're doing and what you did is now you got me thinking, is there an anti-inflammatory benefit to that?
I've been wanting to do that study. If there's any kind of neuroprotection from lifelong bilingualism in this illness, it would be a great asset to know. And we can certainly measure that now with the NeuroQuant. And what's really interesting, and I'll just say this very briefly, is that, part of the suspicion or our understanding of what is it that's driving these consequences in the context of bilingualism, well, it turns out there are these brain circuitries, these brain regions that are really important for the control of using one language. So when the brain knows when to suppress the other language, and part of that machinery involves things like the caudate nucleus that are really central to that. So we could potentially do something where let's look at brain regions that we know are very important for this control circuitry when it comes to multiple languages and see, is there any neuroprotection in the CIRS context?
Wow. Well, we've come a long way from when I was in 8th grade and they told me nerves don't regrow.
Yeah.
I think our group, with love and grit and grind and relentlessly thorough work, is going to help really show the beginning and the end of neurodegenerative diseases. It's an exciting time to want to serve people and human beings. And I know you do it every day. We're grateful for all the work you do. Where can people find you? Where can they connect with CIRS Lab, et cetera, et cetera?
Yep. So there's two outlets. Number one is you can go to our website, www.cirslab.com. And then from there, you can gain access to the patient membership if you're interested in joining that. It's sort of a monthly basis sort of fee. You can cancel anytime, but we obviously welcome you. We would love to have patients and be part of the community and sort of be part of the educating piece, because just as it is as important to educate practitioners out there on the illness and researchers, patients need to be just as educated, and all of that needs to work together. And so that's the sort of small contribution that CIRS Lab is doing. The other outlets is you can find us on social media, primarily on Instagram, where we post a lot of content, mainly in English, but we've been doing some content in Spanish whenever we can, and we're hoping to make more content in Spanish as we move forward. We also have pages on YouTube, Facebook, and I think we now have even a TikTok, even though I don't quite engage with that. But we have all of these social media outlets where we try to provide something that's accessible but truthful and respectful to the science and the medicine, the medical understanding of CIRS.
Well, we just appreciate your can-do, empowered attitude with your groups. People get uplifted, hopeful, and are graduating at a higher rate than people without really understanding this illness. You've been a huge part of educating people across the finish line. Thank you for everything you're doing.
Thank you, Eric. It's my pleasure.